Welcome, everyone, and I hope you're doing well. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping announcements. This event is being recorded and will be available to you in the community after this session. We also plan to take questions throughout the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We're going to do our best to monitor the chat window so that you can also post questions and comments there as well. So hello, everybody. My name is Anna Hunsinger, and I'm the Vice President of Community Engagement at Internet2. I'm extremely excited about today's webinar and our featured speakers and panelists. Today's speakers include Alan Blatecki from RTI International, who was the principal investigator on the award that you will hear about today. Also presenting today will be Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld of Brandeis University, Lauren Michael from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and panelist and good friend, Dr. Deborah Dent from Jackson State University. We also have a number of focus group participants from the community also on the call, and we welcome your comments in the discussion portion of the event. This project is one that I was fortunate enough to participate as one of the many contributors to the final report, which highlights bridging the digital divide and increasing access to science for many underrepresented communities. It also talks about the importance of addressing systemic challenges to expanding, diversifying, and supporting the development of new communities of scientists and researchers. Before we jump in, I also want to briefly mention a project I'm personally working on alongside with many other great contributors and individuals, including some of us with us today. The National Science Foundation just recently funded Internet2 and the Minority Servant Cyber Infrastructure Consortium, or MSCC, to establish a Cyber Infrastructure Center of Excellence demonstration pilot in support of historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, and other MSIs. You can also find more information about the MSCC on the website at mscc.org. As part of our work, we're currently surveying the community to help us better understand the needs of HBCUs, TCUs, and other minority servant institutions. The survey will also help us identify future potential funding for professional development opportunities and for shared resource opportunities. I would like to encourage all of you here to complete the survey. You can see the link to the survey on this slide, and we will also send out a note with the link to all webinar participants after the event is over. So thank you in advance for your participation. So back to why we are here together. I'm delighted to now seg to Mr. Blatecki. As many of you know, Alan has played a pivotal role in our community in support around and advancing cyber infrastructure to support what we do in our community. Alan is current visiting fellow with RTI, focusing on the integration and deployment of advanced technologies to transform research and education. Many of you also know Alan from his roles, multiple roles that he's played, but also prior to joining RTI, Alan served as the director at the NSF for the Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure. And he's also had other roles. I am just so enthused to have Alan as someone that I also met many, many decades ago too. Can't believe it. But it's just great to have you today with us, Alan. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it to you to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So Joel, if you put up the slides. What we're going to do is give you a quick overview of what this report has, what it's done. Just to give you an overview, this is funded by NSF. We did this study itself in April through September, just a few months ago. We submitted it to NSF on October 3rd. It's available online as well. And we talked to something like 15 focus groups, 88 people, 6 interviews. And you can see the group on the screen here with the team that did these interviews and focus groups. And of course, today we want to share with you sort of what we learned as a way to address the growing digital divide. So next slide. We're at what people are calling the defining moment. And by that, what do we mean? Well, it's a couple things. One is we see global competition ramping up around the world. where you need to have everybody engaged to be competitive and to be economically viable and so forth. And of course, the problem coming up is we've got more and more people, because of the digital divide, who are not able to play anymore in that situation. They're not able to participate or engage in these new technologies. And this is what the NSF director calls the missing millions. In other words, we literally have millions of people who could be involved in advancing technology, doing research and so forth. And it's especially critical for the underrepresented communities and so forth. On the positive side, we're seeing bipartisan interest in this. Congress and a number of legislators are talking about the fact that how do we better address this situation? So let's go to the next slide. And the reason for the report then was NSF has been supporting this sort of activities for 35 years in high performance computing. But at the end of the day, the question is, there are still millions of researchers who have not had access or not using it. And so the question is, why? And that's what the study was about. So with that, let me turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you, Alan. So as Alan introduced, our motivating question for this study was, how can NSF significantly expand, diversify, and support the development of new cohorts and communities of scientists and research to address pressing research, social, and global issues looking far into the future? We focused our study not only on how to engage the missing millions within the fields of computing and data, but also on how the role of computing and data investments in engaging new participants in the nation's research enterprise and across the entire breadth of research domains. Recent events have made clear that there is an urgency in addressing these matters, as Alan mentioned. Furthermore, they can't only be solved only at the levels of NSF-funded research and academic and government contexts, but by considering pipelines at all levels, including K-12 education and community programs, and that impact who participates in research and which societal challenges drive the agenda. Next slide. So we first asked focus group participants what a vision of success looked like, for which we pulled a number of common themes in the report and reflected on this slide. Including key areas for improvement and criteria for success. These led to a number of findings and paths forward that we elaborate on in the paper and in subsequent slides.
So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is just briefly introduce the findings. We're going to go into them in quite a bit more detail. And by the way, on all of the slides, you'll see that we've taken quotes from the focus groups and the individual interviews and featured them at different times. We're not going to read these quotes during the presentations, but we may point you to some of them. And of course, all of them are there as additional thoughts, voices, literally the ground truths of people's lived experience on these issues. But you'll see we're going to take some time to talk about the barriers to access that we heard, the issues of accessibility, the racial, gender, and other forms of underrepresentation that are represented by the missing millions, issues of insufficient engagement, and not just focusing on computation, but also on software and data. And reaching to include and think about diverse fields and disciplines, the role of facilitation, the work at the edge, the openness for really experimentation in order to iterate and succeed, and the systemic change that's needed. Those were all themes that we're now going to take a deep dive in. And so I'm going to hand it back to Alan to give us the overview, given these findings, as to what are some of the pathways that we will be identifying in more detail.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Joel. As Joel said, here's a list of 12, if you will, of what we call paths forward, suggestions about what needs to be done. And we'll kind of go into each of these a little bit, but just to give you a flavor of this, you can see the first 6 here on the left are talking about inclusive access. We're talking about experiments and how things are done. How do we elevate data and software to match what's being spent in computing? Look at long-term community building, funded research issues, looking at the impact of edge technologies. For example, one of the things that we've heard loud and clear from our number of the people is that things like Jupyter notebooks and capabilities of even phones are incredible. How can we use those for research and capabilities? Next slide.
Yeah, and actually, before we move to the next slide, I do want to highlight one of the quotes, because we heard from a lot of the groups this whole notion of NSF looking for not just scientific merits, but also broader impacts. People talked about how broader impacts could be lifted up more strongly in the review process. And that's certainly something that would then speak to the missing millions.
Right. Okay, then to continue on, the other 6 here at the top, you see engaging leadership, looking at consortium building across directorates and agencies, because it's not, again, as Lauren said earlier, not just NSF, it's the much larger societal and governmental players that need to be involved here. So let's go to the next slide. We'll actually start going through each of these things. So the first one here is talking about ensuring inclusive access. And here we're talking about how do we expand investments in apprenticeships, internships, and training grants. And this is again to how do we give people the opportunity to get engaged with these resources? Having access isn't enough. How do you get experiential experience with it? So you see in each, and you'll see in each of these paths forward, we have 2 levels of capabilities. We have short-term, which are typically listed first, and then longer-term issues. One of the things that was also, we heard loud and clear, was that often we don't look at what it takes to sustain the effort long-term. It's sort of we do this and we're done. And clearly it needs to be more than that. One of the things that we also heard was that we have to find a way to make these technologies and capabilities much more easy to use. I love some of the quotes we got, but one of the one was, you see here in number 1E, for example, we talk about how do we explore investments that don't require command line expertise. You don't have to be a computer scientist to use the capabilities. How do we do that sort of thing? Next slide. And here we were suggesting to NSF about experimenting with different ways to do grants and research. And for example, the first one here, we talked about block grants. And here the intent is to say, is there a way to provide a funding to be able to do things more from a planning perspective and build a community, rather than saying, I've got the community already, and here's what we want to do. Is there a way to experiment with different solicitations review processes? As Joel mentioned earlier, how do we give broader and more important weight to some of the broader impact capabilities? And in the longer term, again, the same issue here. How do we begin to look at having a more balanced portfolio where you continue the scientific expertise and capabilities, but have a broader definition of what high risk, high reward might mean in terms of reaching these missing millions?
All right. We also heard repeatedly a need to elevate investments in software and especially data, as we mentioned back in the list of 12 key findings, and to a level that exceeds or meets what has been significant nationally coordinated capabilities for large-scale computing. In particular, focus group participants saw data discoverability, standard formats, sustained access, interfaces, and reproducibility as essential to democratizing access to research and research career paths. And there is a need for nationally coordinated efforts to make data available to established researchers and citizens yet to be engaged, rather than leaving the responsibility for data capabilities in the hands of individual established researchers and their variously resourced institutions. Next slide. Expanding even more on data and software, investments need to be informed by both producers and users of software and data by building communities that can inform and prioritize new data sets and opportunities for common formats, interfaces, and tools. We need solutions that bring data sets, software, and computing to schools and citizens who have not yet been engaged, that create new communities of researchers by providing them with common tools to tackle problems they care about using data. And large-scale computing is often a few steps beyond these important pipelines.
Super. And continuing, what we also identified as an important pathway is to expand the scope of funded research. One of the focus groups said, if you were to set up size today at the NSF with a clean sheet, what would that look like? And, in a sense, we have some legacy thinking about computation that perhaps can be, if you will, left behind as we move forward to what computers represent in today's world. And of course, using language of social impact in solicitations, we're seeing it more and more, and the focus groups said, do even more along those lines. And additionally, people, as Alan mentioned, pointed to things like Jupyter notebooks and other technologies of what people call edge computing. So not necessarily linked to high performance computers, but distributed technologies that are in the lab, in the classroom, on a broad basis, but that are part of the cloud, that are interconnected in various ways. And in a sense, the ubiquitous nature of computation in society today really requires a different level of thinking about what it means to include or reach the missing millions. Back to you, Alan.
Thanks. And here you see the focus begin to say more on the community building, if you will. How do we begin to build and dialogue and learning across these other underrepresented communities? And one of the things that we heard was, for example, number 7A here is maybe we ought to look at experimenting with language in how we describe these activities. One of the issues is you get into a culture speak, if you will. This is the way we've always done it, and everybody knows how it's done. But if you're new to the research area in science, this may be foreign to you. So there's a way to start looking at writing these initiatives in a different way, using language, which will help break down some of those barriers. The same with experimenting then with cross partnerships. How do we begin to build this next generation communities? And especially, how do we begin to start building a capability for professional development, for workforce development? We looked at some of the new issues looking at, for example, with artificial intelligence. Is there a way now to use some of that, for example, in helping address some of these issues? And the flip side of that is, of course, it's also going to do the opposite if we don't understand how bias is related to all this. So again, some understanding of what that's going to take and require. Next slide. And this will be, you've heard some of these pieces earlier, but here what we're talking about is how do we accelerate the importance of broader impacts? Typically, broader impacts have not received the same level of scrutiny or importance of a lot of things at NSF. And so the issue is, can we begin to talk about broader impacts in a different way? For example, one of the things that struck me anyway in the conversations we had is why, if I have a local research need, isn't that, how do I recognize that at the national level? How do I begin to use the stuff that's in my own community as a way to build into the research at the larger levels? We talked about having more building ideas of practice. Are there best practices, for example, for broader impact that we ought to look at that can be shared? What worked in one community, can it be applied somewhere else? How do we begin to provide that sort of information and sharing of capabilities? So with that, Lauren.
Thank you. So in PAP 9, we summarize what we heard with regard to investments in community building and cyber infrastructure with respect to sustainability. So that went from, considering that large scale computing systems and other systems in support of various cyber infrastructure should be prioritized and evaluated in terms of societal gain per investment, including environmental costs and human resources, among other aspects of sustainability, and that the human costs and sort of social costs needed to be considered, especially for making sure that community building initiatives are sustained well into the future. Next slide. And given the cross-cutting criticality of cyber infrastructure across national research, the national research enterprise, there was also widespread agreement that coordination and community building had to happen across institutions and funding agencies, recognizing economies of scale and enhanced representation by building bridges between silos. And I'll hand it off
Super.
to Joel.
Yeah, thank you. The last couple points that are part of the paths that we're identifying builds on the fact that there are literally dozens of consortia and partnerships emerging around consortia around data and computing. Some of you were in a workshop that we held a couple of years ago as part of the CARC group, in which we asked about 20 different consortia to draw a map of the ecosystem. And some of them had a tree, some of them had circles and diagrams, some of them had houses with rooms. None of them, though, were really satisfactory in representing my count has over 100 multi-stakeholder consortia in this space. And so we're suggesting that we really need to understand the ecosystem as an ecosystem in order to reach the missing millions. And then the last thing is that the advisory committee for OAC, the other advisory boards, including the National Science Board, have been starting to use the language of missing millions, which we are lifting up with this report. And what we want to do is to have all of the activities that we're talking about front and center stage in front of this group, because it's a continuous learning, experimental, iterative process of figuring out how to have more inclusive science and engineering going forward. So that feedback loop is important, as is the one with practitioners in the field. Back to you, Alan.
Okay, so that's a quick overview of the report. It said things we discussed. There's, as Joel mentioned, some of the quotes are quite interesting. We included them because they give you a flavor that the official report doesn't have. And if you look at the full report, you'll see even more quotes that are very germane, I think, to this activity. So I think, Deborah, you were part of the group and so forth. So have you have any thoughts on what you learned and what you felt about the report?
Yes, I have. Once we got the report back, it was really good to see the results of the report, because there's we hear from different groups, parts and bits and parts of everything, and this report kind of brought everything together, and it was more like a focus. Okay, so now we knew that we needed information. We needed to do something about workforce development. We know that we needed to do something about basic research or block grants, or what you want, however you want to call it. But now that you brought it all back together in this report, it can be like a more targeted, so that you can look at it and then we can address it and try to eat this elephant one bite at a time.
Thank you, Deborah. So Anna, I guess I'll turn it back to you for moderating any questions and issues.
Yes, thanks. And thank you, Alan, Joel, and Lauren, and Deb, for your remarks and taking us through that. I will encourage questions from the audience, and you can put them in the chat window or the Q&A section of your Zoom. Let me start with one question as just to get us started here. So if the National Science Foundation were to respond to key findings in this report, what impacts could we expect? Who would like to tackle that one?
I'll start. I'm sure others will all want to lean in on this one. But I'll give a very concrete example. A colleague of mine who does work with data and water quality, Steve Diggs in California, recently flew on behalf of ESIP to Flint to meet with them. He's a Black data scientist in a Black community, and still they were quite distrustful as he showed up, because tons of people have been showing up asking them to look at their water quality data, extracting the data, but giving nothing back to the community. And he looked at it and said, these data still won't help you produce high quality water that you can trust. Your data needs work. And And I share that story because I think the impact that we could imagine is that HBCUs, TCUs, HSIs, other minority serving institutions in their communities would be using data to ask questions and to learn about things that are important to students, faculty, and staff, and to community members in a way that literally is represented by millions of people involved in the research that are not now part of the conversation. So I think the impact that the NSF could point to is hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of questions being addressed with data and computing that previously were not in play.
Yeah, I have some examples. The first one is that when NSF funded the Empower program, up that point, we wanted to get involved in the CC Star. We wanted to write CC Star grants, but we couldn't, and we never did understand why we could not get the grants written properly. So with that particular program, we had Jim Bottom and team that came in, and there was a lot of mentorship that took place, and we were successful in getting a CC Star granted. And as a result of that work, it was a bunch of us involved in it, and we all stayed together, and we ended up eventually starting the Minority Serving Cyber Infrastructure Consortium. And so what we're finding as with that, we're together and we can share information. And our theme is we can do more to get together than we can alone. So as we're getting funded, we are still united and we're on one accord, and we can move and get more stuff done with the funding than we would if we were just to get little pots of funding here and there.
I think the other thing you'll begin to see, I'm hoping, is that NSF will be more sensitive to the fact that not everybody's at the same place in their career and capabilities. So for example, we tend to think, well, everybody knows what HPC is. Well, that's not necessarily true. So if we look at just that single issue, when you look at cyber infrastructure, what about I don't like the word leading edge and trailing edge, but the point is, you may not need an HPC device to do your work. Maybe you need a laptop. Well, what might that mean in terms of what you provide, what might NSF might do in terms of providing support? And so I think you'll see more emphasis or willingness to look at how do you bring people to the table, if you will? How do you begin to give them the capabilities to play? As you saw in our findings comment, it's not just about access, it's about use as well. And so I think there's that slope, if you will, that we need to say, how do we do things at the earlier end to get people involved?
Yeah, at various sort of places in the findings as we were writing the report, I think we're reminded of a phrase, accessibility equals access plus usability, right? And that really spans the entire breadth of cyber infrastructure that researchers and yet to be researchers require in order to contribute to the nation's research enterprise.
And I think the other thing we didn't mention today, but Joel did mention with the edge computing, but the point is, the laptop I have today is yesterday's supercomputer. I mean, the point is the technology capabilities are so great. How do we begin to leverage that? I mean, the amount of capacity, even in your iPhones now, is enormous. And we haven't figured out a way to effectively use that for research and education. And we ought to, because it's already out there.
Thank you. We have quite a good number of questions are starting to come in. So thank you. And also we have some colleagues from NSF participating in the webinar as well. Let's go to one of the questions in the chat window from Tracy Futhy. Beyond the purpose of the report in raising awareness of the missing millions generally, and to spur change at NSF, are there 2-3 things you would point out that we, members and leaders at campuses, can do?
I'll make an initial thought along those lines. And I know both, I'm going to prompt Deborah and Lauren on each of them. So Lauren is very much involved in a network of facilitators across campuses. And I think it's important to hear what she has to say about each campus having people who are designated as facilitators who can help connect researchers to computing and data capabilities. So that's one prompt that I'll offer, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute. But the second, Deborah mentioned MSCC, and I would say that every campus should be contacting Deborah and Damian Clark and the other leaders of that organization to join, because they're looking to have common staffing resources for cybersecurity, for workforce development, and for other things of importance. And as she said, you literally can do more together than you can separately. So I'd ask Deborah to also say a little bit more about just what is MSCC and what does it represent. So prompt first for Laura on facilitation, and then Deborah to do a little bit of outreach.
Thank you, Joel. And thinking about what campus leaders can do, right? You know, most campuses, we're talking about academic institutions, in that case, probably are working in the space of undergraduate and graduate education, where graduate education is really for people who've already chosen research as a career. I think there is a lot of opportunity to incorporate basic data interaction practices, tools into undergraduate curricula. And to ensure that those are accessible equitably across your student populations. Right now, a lot of basic skills in computing and data science outside of bespoke data science curricula are left to individuals like myself to teach workshops, do trainings, and undergraduates and even graduate students have to pursue those on their own time in addition to their degree work, rather than those being incorporated naturally across a breadth of not just research areas, but I think majors, even at the undergraduate level. So that's one thing I would emphasize at the campus level for sure.
Oh, Deborah, go ahead.
Am I me?
Yeah, there you are.
Oh, I'm okay. Okay. The MSCC, as we said earlier, is what we can do together, do more together than what we can't alone. And some of the things that we're looking at and that we're working on is we're going to have, as we're utilizing the funding that we got in order to start this pilot center of excellence, is we're looking at how we can start workshops, presidential workshops, where we can inform our campuses, our leadership about cyber infrastructure. What is it? And then we can let our campus, our researchers really understand, and then we can share resources. That's the thing that really got us excited, because we know that a lot of times we can't afford certain resources. And now we have a platform that we can figure out how we can share those resources, how we can do workforce development, and what can we do to just accelerate our research. So we're really excited. We're in the beginning stages of what we're doing. And as we said earlier, we'd love for everybody to give us a call, but we're really excited, and we know that we're going to be able to expand our capabilities across all HBCUs, TECUs, and minority serving institutions.
Let me respond to a different suggestion to Tracy's comment. I think one of the points I would suggest that campuses make to NSF is help them understand the importance of building communities. And so, for example, we often talk about leading with technology. Well, why don't we start leading with communities? Why don't we start leading with science communities itself? And I would posit back to the group and saying, if you're at a campus, when you decide to create a new department, for example, you don't just hire a professor, you have to talk about all the stuff that makes it work. And this is no different. So I think trying to understand that it's an ecosystem we have to build here. It's not just hiring a person do X. It's looking at all these things have to work together. So I guess understanding the complexity is not just about science, it's not just about technology, it's about the community as well. So that would be one of my points I would make.
And if I could piggyback on your point, Alan, because I think it's a really important one. I was involved in some efforts by the CARC consortium around career paths for people in this space. And what we found is that most campuses don't really have a good career path for people who do work with research data and computing. And so they don't know how to lift up the work. They complain that people are hired away by the private sector. In some respect, that's a win. You're actually creating workforce for society. But part of the point is some of those folks are passionate about the research data and computing work, but they don't feel that their work is valued or supported in meaningful ways. So I think there's work to be done in the ecosystem. And what was interesting is that when we brought together folks who do this kind of work, we said, well, most professions try to control entry to their profession in order to increase wages. And they said, no, we want to include entry. We want more people coming in. We're not going to be like a traditional professional society that closes off entry. They actually were quite enthusiastic about this being an inclusive space where more people can make more of a difference.
And to add to a comment you made, Joel, about what I think is workforce development for research computing and data professionals. I think there's already, somewhat of a movement, maybe more so across well-resourced institutions in terms of their research enterprise, but in investing in the human effort that's necessary to sustain cyber infrastructure. And that goes back to one of our paths forward, recognizing that sustainability for cyber infrastructure is multifaceted and really should include considerations for how you demonstrate to your workforce that they are valued in a way that is reflected in sustained investment.
Anna, I'd like to interrupt you just a second. I just noticed the chat thing here from chat note from Steve Crabado from Oregon. He says the state I represent does not have an HBCU or TCU, yet of course we have underrepresented communities. How best for states like ours to engage in this initiative? And I'd like to just suggest something we sort of mentioned in our earlier comments, and that is lead with the science. There must be things going on in those communities that may be unique in climate, they may be unique in energy, they may be unique in health, which you don't see because it's maybe unique to that community. How do we bring that into the larger set of issues? So again, rather than saying we need help to get involved, we have value we can bring to the overall science issues is another way, I think, to try and start that discussion and conversation.
Yeah, if I could, leverage that at ACM, the High Performance Computing Society, the last couple of years, they've done workshops on Black Lives Matter, on maternal health, on COVID, on other topics, in which they bring high school and undergraduate youth together and give them support, mentoring in looking at data and doing analysis on issues that they care about. And they knock people's socks off in terms of visual representations of, sometimes horrific events such as police shootings. But the point is, you are empowering people with data to address things that are of importance. And so I would say also, is just emphasizing what Alan is saying, go to the communities as communities and find ways to provide them pathways onto the computing resources, onto the software, onto the data. The NSF has big data hubs that will be delighted to partner with you, on that, because it's really about, we use the phrase, nothing about us without us. People being able to use resources in ways that work for them.
I was thinking, Joel, about some of the earlier conversations we had about IRBs in their own communities.
Yeah.
Where their own data is actually important, and we tend to throw it away. I don't know if you want to say any more about that, but.
Sure. One of the focus groups, they said, look, our campus has an IRB, but our community has data at the community level, and there are no data protections or mechanisms, in the community. Now, some people have the experience with campus IRBs that are very restrictive in how they, run things, and they're not. I think there's some culture change that's needed in some IRBs to be community oriented. But why not take the core principle of protecting people's privacy with data and have that as a resource to the community? That's what one of the focus groups, leaned in on, and it's appropriate in a post-industrial digital era.
Thank you. I'm going to stick to a question. I think it segues to your role also as faculty, Joel. So, and then I'll call your attention to a question that also came up from John McKenzie from Cornell. So take a look at that. But let's talk a little bit about what type of things could a faculty member do, or things that could be done in a class. And take a look at his questions too, because part of his question is also how has NSF reached out to youth and undergrads for participatory research? And he has an example there linked to that. So would any of you want to comment about that? Certainly would encourage anybody that's faculty in the audience to also chime in through the chat window. So
and by the way, I'd like to, first of all, thank you, John, for posting this. Most people don't know Cornell is an Ivy League university, but it's also a land-grant institution. And so it's connected with the agricultural extension to county offices all over the state of New York. And every state has land-grant institutions that have these agricultural extension kinds of offices. So that represents a fascinating infrastructure to continue this conversation. But I'd also highlight John's comment on the important role of storytelling. I don't know, is Dean Allo here? Because I think he might do a little bit of storytelling himself.
Let's see if Dr. Allo is with us today.
If not, that's okay. But at any rate, among the MSCC folks, there are stories to be told about success stories. And by the way, I just learned that we're seeing questions, but not everyone can see the questions. So that's helpful to know. Thank you, Jennifer. But the story that Dr. Allo told us was that he had a student who got into a couple of different graduate programs. He teaches at an HBCU and was quite excited in computer science. When he congratulated the student said, yes, that the student was excited, but didn't get into their most preferred program because they didn't know anything about high performance computing, the very issue that Alan mentioned. And it was a wake-up call for him to say, what are we doing around providing our students exposure to things that are at the leading edge of the field?
Yeah, and I'll add, this ties back to some of my comments earlier when I mentioned that training and how to work with data and computing is important, I think, as a pipeline into research careers at the undergraduate level, certainly before graduate school. And some of the tried and true mechanisms for incorporating that, like I said, are not necessarily just within bespoke data science programs and minors, but by incorporating problems that students care about through storytelling into their curriculum, where they're getting to do research, not necessarily as a semester-long course that's all about how to do research, but where different courses can incorporate a little bit here and there of what it looks like to do research with data and computing, to sort of motivate students toward that career path if they have a genuine interest, or at least to have provided them the opportunity to decide whether or not they'd be interested.
Okay, I'm gonna take us through a couple of questions that came in the Q&A. Can you say anything, the scope of the report, did it cover anything around any kind of strategy or recommendations or things that were expressed through the focus groups on connectivity for minority serving institutions, HBCUs and TCUs, to their regional networks to allow them to connect to the national fabric of resources, national backbones, and so forth? Did any of that come up in the report?
I think there's a couple of responses to that. I mean, it certainly came up, and that was because without access, having access to these issues, it's tough. In fact, we heard from, I think it was some of the institutions in New Mexico that, forget what it was, don't even have wireless, because they're so remote. So yeah, that's absolutely a critical issue. Now, the good news on the flip side of this is that the bill that was passed, the infrastructure bill passed by Congress, has a significant amount of money set aside for states to extend broadband. So that may help. But again, I want to go back to our point earlier, and Lauren mentioned it. Access is essential, but it's not enough. So let's not, I mean, one of the concerns I have is with that whole infrastructure bill is they're going to say, okay, we spent $500 million to put fiber out there, but we didn't talk about how people could use it. And so that's, that's a separate issue.
And actually, one of the things that, and Deborah, you might want to say a little bit more about this, that we've been talking about with MSCC is to do stakeholder mapping work on broadband in the communities where those investments are happening, so that there is a level of stakeholder engagement in the different ways that the broadband can make a difference on the ground. On health data, on civic engagement, on education, or what have you. Because Alan, you're exactly right. If you just invest in the technology without putting the social systems in place that go with the technology, it will fall short of its potential.
We just had a conversation with somebody, and there's a practice that goes on is that you can buy a lot of software, and it's all just really high-tech software, and you get some special funding, and you go out there and you just go buy the software, and then you put it on the shelf, and you never use it, and it's called shelfware. And that's what will happen, is that we can put all of this in place and we don't know how to use it, and then it'll just be there. And so the problem is not solved. We, as Lauren said, we have to do training. We have to make sure that we know how to utilize this technology. So it's more than just getting it, it's knowing how to use it.
And what's so frustrating, Deborah, you bring up, the point is, look at what kids can do with their iPhones and capabilities. I mean, my God, why can't we take some of that on the science side and research side and say, how do we do the same sort of thing? Because a 9 or 10-year-old can do far more I can on my iPhone, I'm sure, because we don't take advantage of that sort of technology shift that's happened to us.
Yeah, and I think there's a really important role of the community building aspect to help prevent shelfware, right? To leverage the community of researchers and not just the people who produce software, but who use it, to inform opportunities to build common tools, common data formats, enhance reproducibility, but also make it easier for instructors to incorporate these sorts of topics and tools into their curriculum by coming up with sort of common methodologies, common data sets that can be used in education settings and also in research.
Yeah, one of the things that, to follow up what Laura was saying, is one of the reasons we spend so much time on sustainability. We don't spend enough time on that. And I'm reminded, Joel, is it the Menominee talk about looking ahead 8 generations? I mean, yeah, we don't even think that way.
Yeah, no, we had a president of one of the college who's also from the Menominee tribe, who said when they make tribal decisions, that I think he said they look 6 generations ahead.
Yeah.
But the point was that most of our decisions in computing, research, and data, have a horizon measured in 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years. But we also heard from the focus groups the importance of the language we use. For example, in one of the focus groups, we had some people from community fab labs. There are 2,000 of them in the world. And they said that, one woman said that when they did workshops on robotics, mostly it was boys who came. When they did workshops on social change, it was a much more gender balanced mix of folks that showed up. And so, it's computing for what? And if the computing opportunities speak in a language that people relate to, you're going to draw more of the missing millions into the conversation.
Let me seg to a couple of other questions that have come up. So this was a report presented to NSF. The question is, has there been any interest that you're aware of from other funding agencies as well? And I guess, Alan, have you, as the report is making the rounds, have you heard from any other funding agencies? Do you have any comments in that regard?
Well, no, I have heard from other agencies that are looking at it. Now, I don't know what that means, to be honest, but the short answer is yes, we have heard from others saying this looks interesting. We ought to explore that. And so, for example, one of the things that we learned from our focus groups is the Department of Agriculture, for example, can fund apprenticeships, but they can't do it for specific purpose. Well, NSF can do that. So if they get together, suddenly we've got the science side and the community side solved. So there are some interesting discussions starting along those directions.
Well, and I might also note, President Biden's very first executive order on January 20th was a requirement that all federal agencies develop equity assessments and put equity plans to assess whether their standard mission-driven activities are diverse and inclusive in how they operate and how they function. And so every federal agency is asking this question, frankly, a question that's long overdue. So in a sense, the NSF reaching out to the missing millions is likely to be one among many initiatives at the federal level as agencies really ask this very important question about equity.
And without sounding too skeptical, because I am very hopeful, I think we're yet to see whether and how different agencies work together, coordinate, cooperate, as I think that will be necessary. And that's certainly what we found in this study.
Yeah, people talked about how different federal agencies all show up with chimney kinds of thinking about just within their narrow mandate and not doing the kind of collaboration that Alan was just describing.
There's just a note in the chat here from Michael Adeline. You want to read that, Anna? Or?
Yes. So apropos to what you just brought up, Michael is bringing up, he just served on the FCC USDA task force on precision, on the Precision Agricultural Task Force looking at broadband in rural areas. Read the report because the same points that are being talked about are in our report. Michael, it'd be great if you don't mind posting the link to the report, or maybe we can send it when we send the survey back to everybody that participated.
I would just point out, remember, our report is literally only 2 months old. So it's just gotten there. But I said the response has been pretty interesting so far because people have thought it, and we struggle with the length of it because it was, back to what I had to smile when Deborah talked about shelfware. If the report's too long, it becomes shelfware. So a report is fairly brief, but it does try to get at some of the central points that's easy to digest and think about.
Okay, We only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to wrap us up. Alan is PI of this effort. So in addition to now disseminating this, what's next for you after this?
Well, I'm going to be talking to whoever is interested to say, how can we move this forward? I mean, because this is a community effort. I mean, I guess that's my comment. We have to find a way to work together in a much more effective way. And the power of different communities is they bring other things to the table, which, and the end result is far better. And I would simply point out that this report is so good only because of the great people that both, led it, leave myself out of that part of it. But anyway, led it and who participated. I mean, we had some terrific people. In fact, they all were in a very different way. And it was actually fascinating to have various focus groups because you never knew quite what was going to happen, but it was good.
Okay. Well, thank you for those great closing remarks. I'm going to wrap us up. I want to thank all Alan, Lauren, Joel, and Deb for joining us today. But thanks to everybody that made time to join us today. So thank you. A recording of the event is going to be made available and posted on the Internet to I2 Online webpage. And please look for the survey that we're going to send as soon as you leave the Zoom. And with that said, thank you very much. I hope you all have a wonderful and safe holiday season. And please take care and hope to see you soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.